you're all here for Roger, so you all know who Roger Smith is, I hope. And if you don't, well, listen very carefully, and through the presentation you'll learn an awful lot, not just who Roger is, but an approach to watchmaking that's really unique in the world. And you know, even within the enormous pool of talent that we've got on show in the other galleries, I think Roger sort of still stands in a very, very different plane. So without further ado, thank you for coming, and Roger.
Thank you, James. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The theme of my talk today is very much about discovery. When George Daniels passed away in October 2011, he left a peerless legacy to the world of watchmaking. It was a legacy which exalted George as the greatest watchmaker of the last 250 years. And having had the honour of working with him, I wholeheartedly agree with that assessment. In working with George, I really thought I knew, or at least had an informed opinion on how he had become the greatest of all watchmakers. And I did. That was until George bequeathed his treasured Riversdale Studio to me so that I could continue his unique work. 2 years on, I have finally finished the clearance, cataloguing and reconstituting of the Riversdale Studio into my own. What I didn't realise was the extent to which this would be a journey of discovery, and one which would cause me to evaluate what made George truly great. So today I am going to reveal those discoveries and share what has now been revealed to be perhaps the greatest horological battle of the last 250 years. Because to become the greatest of watchmakers, George had to overcome what should have been insurmountable odds. So let me take you through my discoveries. In the early stages of clearing the Riversdale Studio, I was certainly distracted by my other commitments. However, as I gradually began to peel back the layers of the Daniels Studio, I began to get drawn into the stories these told about the Daniels method. For those of you here today who do not know what the Daniels method is, let me take a moment to explain. It is a name that I coined some time ago to describe a technique of watchmaking which completely turned the conventions of our craft on their head. Traditionally, the British watchmaking industry was built up of some 34 highly skilled, highly specialised individual trades, which would culminate in the creation of one single pocket watch. One man would spend his working life focused on just one discipline. In the late 1960s, this once great British watchmaking industry was in its final death throes. The sparse remnants of the trade were now the talk of legend, with perhaps only a few old boys left practicing their highly specialised but ultimately isolated trades. George Daniels single-handedly changed the course and destiny of watchmaking by setting about mastering virtually all the trades required to complete a pocket watch. So this became the Daniels method. Did George intend to create a method in his own name? Almost certainly not, at least from the outset anyway. His intention was to solve the almost impossible problem of single-handedly making a pocket watch. But Daniels being Daniels, he could only accept perfection, and so he began the arduous task in the mastery and eventual perfection of 32 of the 34 individual trades. He spent an inordinate amount of time researching archives, corresponding with horological scholars, and searching out the last of these highly skilled craftsmen in an attempt to learn and ultimately perfect these disappearing skills. On reflection, during my own study of the Daniels method, it takes an inordinate amount of time, self-discipline, self-sacrifice, and an obsessional approach to continually critique your own work and then to better it. I'm sure that my father, who is now a retired medic, who witnessed my obsessional approach at first hand, would more than happily throw the word monomaniac into the mix. Fortunately, Daniel secured this information for future generations by writing what I believe to be his seminal work, a book entitled Watchmaking, which is a step-by-step guide to making a watch by hand. Here we have the very first notes and sketches for this book, which I presume he jotted down as he was making the components for one of his watches. During the task of reconstituting the studio, it became clear to me that George Daniels threw very little away, and thank heavens, because a studio is a time capsule of his achievements, his escapement work, his skill as a craftsman, his extraordinary body of work, which he created over a career spanning more than 60 years, is all there to be seen. A career which saw the creation of some of the finest and most technically advanced mechanical watches to have ever been created by the hand of one man. But as if this is not enough, the studio contains his jottings, reflections and notes, which were the practical foundation of his great skill as a communicator through his writing, illustrating and extensive lecturing. His studio was the armoury for which he took legendary battles with individuals, horological scholars and the watchmaking industry. And of course, it took me back to my own experiences working with George, from my first meetings as a 17-year-old horological student, to the lunches we spent in his local pub, to the long hours spent in the studio building watches, and through to the day he died. Throughout all my time spent with Daniels, what I miss most is that behind this overwhelming, successful, and sometimes difficult character was simply a man who had a passion for watchmaking, or to be more accurate, a passion for the advancement of the mechanical timekeeper. Daniels had a tough upbringing, which I am sure played some part in the shaping of his character. He was known for his ruthless determination to succeed, and I've spoken to many people over the years who witnessed both the good and formidable sides of George. During my time with George in the Riversdale Studio, I witnessed all sides of the Daniels character, and when looking back, I always attempt to put my feet into his shoes and to look through his eyes in order to understand him better. For George Daniels was a man who had devoted his life to understanding the history of horology. Due to his innate practical skills, he had an understanding of the mechanics of horology which went way beyond most people's basic comprehension. His working day at times was twice the average of mere mortals, and George simply did not see why he should spend time dealing with someone who clearly did not appreciate or who was unwilling to further their understanding of a particular subject. In his mind, why should he? For all of Daniel's knowledge was based on total commitment and hands-on practical mastery, which cannot be argued with. However, there was an amazing side to Daniels, which fortunately I experienced more often than not. If Daniels detected that the person standing in front of him had something about them, then he would put 100% into that person and offer support, advice, and friendship. If at any point that person waned in their quest to succeed at whatever they were attempting to achieve, then Daniels would end the relationship, because in his eyes, he could see no point in pursuing a route which would only waste his precious time. And believe me, time is the most precious commodity to the person who devotes their life to measuring it. George's generosity was often untold, and today we are enjoying the working legacy of that in his Daniels Educational Trust, which has been set up to support the disciplines of horology, building, engineering, and medicine. The basic ethos of the trust is the basic ethos of the man himself. If you want to learn and are prepared to put in the years of effort that is required to succeed in your chosen field, then Daniels will only be too happy to back that student up with financial assistance. If your interest wanes, then so will Daniel's. The 24 watches that Daniel's made in this studio, then, are really only a fraction of the man's work. But like all great endeavours, fame comes only from what the public can see. Behind his watches, Daniel's had an extraordinary urge to educate the watchmaking world and tell them that he had a unique story and an opinion which needed to be listened to. During the move, I found drawings, sketches, discarded components, notes, jigs, catalogues, and prototype movements which span 60 years of watchmaking. Collectively, this information amounts to an incredible investment in personal time. What I certainly did not appreciate when I first became aware of George Daniels was that the largest part of his working life was spent studying, researching, educating, and making prototype components. And most of these prototype components would more than likely have been relegated to what he referred to as his graveyard, this old tobacco tin that sat on his bench. This depth of knowledge was so vital to Daniel's success and is evident through his writings. In his book, The Practical Watch Escapement, he describes the duplex escapement, the practicality of its repair and its function, culminating in a pros and cons analysis. I'll read you a short section. The duplex's construction requires most careful and skilled workmanship if it is to work well. The intersection of the roller and the locking teeth is shallow, and tripping will occur if the pivots are slack in the jewel holes. The pressure of the action of the escapement are high, and all holes should be jeweled to prevent wear to the pivots. This is real practical microanalysis. He goes on to say, if the escapement knocks when the balance axis is vertically above the escape wheel, it may be due to worn pivots, allowing the balance wheel to come too close to the wheel. This can also occur through an incorrectly sized locking roller, allowing the pallet to strike an impulse tooth. Duplex wheels are sometimes seen with the locking teeth bent to overcome this fault. The only true solution is to make a new roller. If the area is very small, it can be corrected by slightly shortening the impulse roller. Now, to be able to convey this understanding in words of such clarity is as rare as the understanding itself. He rounds off this duplex section with this statement. The single merit of this escapement is a form of the large impulse given to a radial action to the balanced pallet without sliding friction. And it's this final quote from Daniels which shows his ability to focus and rapidly decipher the pros and cons of a particular escapement. This, of course, was backed up with real practical experience of the escapement, which was important in him developing his views as to which qualities a new practical and efficient escapement should contain. What I find most extraordinary is that this analysis of the duplex escapement is just one of countless examples that Daniels investigated. I'm not sure how many of you have a copy of Watches by Daniels and Clutton, but within the pages of the 1965 first edition, you'll find photographed 68 different escapements spanning some 400 years of watchmaking. Can you imagine just how much time this information would have taken to compile? First of all, Daniels would have had to find these rare escapement examples, which he then had to photograph and inspect in order to gain a practical understanding of their function. This is serious, time-consuming, but very, very necessary work, particularly if you are beginning to form notions that there are improvements to be made in escapement technology itself. Over his lifetime, Daniels wrote 9 books, each allowing him to convey his depth of knowledge to a wider audience. The writing of the books is not an easy process, particularly when so much of the information has to be researched from the scratch, then cross-referenced and presented in a form which must be understood by the layman. Watchmaking took Daniels 2 years of full-time work to complete, which is an extraordinary commitment to education. There have been several books written on escapements, but I believe Daniels is the first to have assessed all the escapements made to date, and he is the first person to have understood and written down what the basic requirements of a practical escapement are. It is with this vast knowledge that he went on to invent the Daniels coaxial escapement. This was George's greatest horological contribution, and he needed a man with exceptional foresight, historical knowledge, and an ingenuity to even consider this historic conclusion. That the commonly used Swiss lever escapement had now had its day, and that a change was needed if the future of mechanical watchmaking was to survive. The story of the coaxial's development and eventual transition from a lone watchmaker's mind and the tools of his bench to being accepted by one of the industry's leading watch companies, Omega, is now legendary. For me, the escapement has always held a great fascination, and I was fortunate to have arrived in the Daniels studio during a critical stage of its industrialization. At that time, we were receiving the first mechanisms from Omega's R&D department at ESSA for examination. It was a very exciting period, as I was able to listen to Daniels' analysis of each of the prototype escapements, and then to examine and develop a greater understanding of this new technology for myself. What has been interesting to me as I catalogue the studio are the small discoveries that add to the epic story of Daniels attempting to change the industry's thinking on escapement design. This image is of the first Daniels watch to contain his coaxial escapement and was completed in 1979. The movement is cased in gold with a silver hand engine turned dial with blued steel hands, displaying minutes, retrograde hours, and seconds. The mechanism is a twin-barreled, key-wound, and with a 1-minute, two-armed tourbillon carriage. Little did he know that the making of this watch was just the very beginning of a 25-year-long Daniels campaign to convince a sceptical watch industry that his escapement was the future of mechanical watchmaking. He began this long journey by approaching Patek Philippe, who had shown an earlier interest in his double-wheel escapement. This image is of a Patek Philippe pocket watch movement, which they converted to take the coaxial escapement in approximately 1980. It was not a success, and even during their presentation of this mechanism to Daniels, it stopped. This stoppage obviously came as little surprise to one of the technicians, because he came forward and prodded it back to life with a sharpened piece of pegwood. On inspection by Daniels, it appeared that the Patek Philippe R&D department had not followed the basic principles of his escapement. Daniels pointed this out, and the technician left without a word to attend another meeting. Undeterred, Daniels asked if he could attempt to fit his escapement into one of their standard wristwatch movements. Patek Philippe agreed to this and presented him with a mechanism for conversion. He took it back to his studio in London and quickly realised that the watch was too thin and would not accept his escapement in its current form. He put the problem to one side, carried on with his day-to-day work, and to let his subconscious mind carry on with solving the problem. One day, the idea of the Daniels slimline coaxial escapement came to mind. But he had one problem, which was that the focus of his studio was pocket watches, and therefore the equipment was focused around this scale of watchmaking. He made the decision to set about gearing up his studio to allow him to work to the micron tolerances that are required for a wristwatch. He tracked down and purchased this high-precision jig borer, which is a Hauser P325. Suddenly, Daniels' life had turned to wristwatch making for the very first time. This machine enabled Daniels to work to microns, and within 3 very intensive and exhaustive weeks, he had made and fitted his escapement into the Patek wristwatch movement. He took the watch along to show them, and Patek Philippe were impressed. They decided to make the escapement themselves and to fit it into several movements of their own for further testing. Again, the results were not good, and it transpired that the advice given by Daniels at the time of handing over of the project was ignored in favour of theoretical horology, as opposed to the practical horology which had served Daniels so well in his career up until that point. Finally, Patek Philippe concluded that the coaxial escapement was not a good escapement, and that it could not work, even though Daniels arrived at the meeting with the very first Daniels pocket watch happily ticking away in his pocket, and with a Patek Philippe wristwatch that he had converted to coaxial strapped to his wrist. Dismayed but undeterred, his work continued, and he began to look at convincing other manufacturers to take up his escapement. This collection of paper traces from Daniels' timing machine is very interesting, as it shows watches from various manufacturers that he was obviously looking at. Of interest are the third and fourth traces from the top. The third is of one of the prototype ETA mechanisms from ETA, and the fourth is a paper trace of one of two Rolexes that Daniels converted to coaxial escapement. A very important document in the history of the coaxial escapement. This is an image of a previously unknown zenith movement, which has been converted to take a Daniels coaxial escapement. There is no mention of this being done, and perhaps Zenith was on Daniels' list of manufacturers who he was going to approach in an attempt to persuade them to take up his escapement. We may never know. This image is one of several coaxial sketches made by Daniels, which form part of a series of escapements that he made and fitted into branded watches. I'm still trying to find out which particular watch this coaxial was made for, but my suspicions is lying towards one of the Rolexes. This image probably draws a close to the epic 25-year battle of Daniels' mission to change their view on mechanical watchmaking. And it is one of the early prototype Omega movements which the developers ETA cased up into a standard dial and case so that the staff could test the mechanisms in wear. If you look closely, you can see that this escapement technology was so new to the Swiss technicians that they did not know how to correctly spell the name coaxial. Today, Daniels' life experiences of escapements is summed up in one very easily read book called The Practical Watch Escapement. And yet it is interesting that this book, which contains over 60 years of practical watchmaking experience within its pages, is still largely ignored. And today, I see many new or certainly rejuvenated historical escapements on the market where it is evident that the designer has not read or understood the basic principles of a modern practical escapement. Over the course of the year that it took me to disassemble, record and transport the Daniels Studio to mine, I feel that I have learned so much more about who Daniels was and why he achieved more than anyone else within horology. Furthermore, I feel that unless you have single-handedly made a watch by hand, nobody will ever fully understand just how impossible those achievements can be, and particularly if you set the aesthetic and technical brilliance of a Daniels watch as your benchmark. Daniels' intricate understanding of the mechanics of every single component that goes into the creation of a complete watch was beyond modern perception, and this is why he so effortlessly created the finest collection of watches attributed to the hand of one man. Whenever I visit London, I find myself with a little spare time, I will often visit the National Gallery, and although my knowledge of art could be written on the back of a postage stamp, I take an enormous amount of pleasure from standing in front of some of the great works of art found within. Although I have little comprehension of the technique used in creating the work, what I have come to understand is that my pleasure is derived from knowing that this work of art is only a tiny snapshot in the life of the artist who created it. And in order for the artist to have attained the necessary skill to put that tiny amount of paint of the correct colour and tone in that particular position will have taken many, many years of struggle, rejection, and probably all with the incessant doubt that they may at some stage have to face reality and realise that they will never make it as an artist. This is a sense that I now get when I hold a Daniel's watch, for it takes a lifetime of experiences to create the pieces that he did. So when a collector buys a Daniel's watch, they are not buying the year that it took Daniel's to make the piece, they are buying the many years of self-sacrifice that it takes in order for a man to rise to a level where he can create greatness. It is for this reason that I consider Daniel's pieces to be far more than pieces of horology, and they are, in reality, major works of art, mechanical art. I have given you a small glimpse into Daniel's studio, where I found test escapements, movements, jigs, and drawings, which were all part of this incredible personal battle that Daniel's took on in order to fulfill his desire to make a difference to mechanical timekeeping and to convince the watchmaking world that the mechanical watch has far more to offer than a quartz watch ever will. He succeeded. Today, I hear many watchmakers being described as master watchmakers and hear them talking about their passion for their craft. And yet their passion, when compared to Daniel's, can only ever be described as skin deep. It is the equivalent of an artist being described as a master for finishing some sketches. For Daniel's career was a bizarre and unique path, which only he could have taken. A single man in a single studio, successfully re-educating the watchmaking world, that the tiny world that he had created was nevertheless of importance and should be taken seriously. It is this one single achievement that today I find most extraordinary. Since completing the move, I look at George through very different eyes. I feel that I have finally grown up, and when I sit down to use one of his tools or to momentarily sit at his bench, I now get a truer understanding of sense of what drove him to achieve what he did. I hope that my presentation to you today has given you all a different perspective into what lies behind the stature of a great watchmaker like Daniel's. We could naturally assume that someone of Daniel's stature would only be found within a few dusty pages of a history book, but I think that we should all feel relieved and privileged when we consider that Daniel's and his story managed to find a voice above all the noise, speed, and distraction of our modern day life. I hope that perhaps in another couple of 100 years, this world will give another watchmaker of Daniel's stature a chance to breathe. We can only hope. Throughout my knowing of Daniel's, relationship was very businesslike. After all, we were both watchmakers. There was a large difference in age, and as you can imagine, as a man born of his generation, he was not willing or able to voice his emotions. So I would like to believe that Daniel saw something in me which was left unsaid, and yet caused him to bequeath his studio to me. This was an incredible moment for me and a culmination of almost 25 years spent in my study, perfection, and practicing the Daniel's method of watchmaking. Daniel's gesture was generous, but also, like the man, eminently practical. He wanted to ensure I could complete the anniversary series of watches that he had asked me to make with him several years earlier. What I also believe contributed to this act was my continual examination and development of his coaxial escapement, which eventually led me to the improvements that I made to his escapement with my single wheel version of his escapement. In my studio, we can make the extraordinary but true claim to being the only maker of watches within Great Britain today. This is a tradition which began with Daniels with the completion of his first watch in 1969. And to this day, British watchmaking has carried on unabated. My concern with watchmaking within Great Britain today is that its focus appears to be on the case, dial, crystals and straps, which in my view amounts to very little. Back to my art analogy. It is surely like making frames, but not actually painting anything. The movements are all made in Switzerland, and ultimately that is where the heart and the art of these watches lies. Today my studio is leading British watchmaking by laying down the foundation and standards of what a resurgent British watchmaking industry should aspire to. I've been making British watches since 1990, and although the numbers of watches that we produce each year is small, we are not reliant upon outside assistance for the creation of these watches. Our continual focus is on the development of new British calibers, which have to be at the cutting edge of mechanical timekeeping innovation, with the use of my single wheel version of the Daniels coaxial escapement, for them to have real horological worth. If the British are ever going to create differentiation from our Swiss watchmaking friends, then innovation is where I believe the true value and spirit of British watchmaking industry should be. And as a watchmaker, we all have to look a little deeper and beyond the case and strap if we are ever to convince the public that there is a future for British watchmaking. In Britain, we have the greatest of all watchmaking heritages, and it is our forefathers who laid down the core of today's modern watchmaking. The British, by their nature, are inventors and creators, and I believe that if we can tap into this inbuilt quality, then there may be a future. This will be the next great horological battle. George Daniels proved that one man can make the world take notice. If a new tradition of British watchmaker can be inspired by this incredible achievement, then we have a real opportunity to carve a niche for a British watchmaking industry. But unless this challenge is taken a little more seriously, then ultimately the British watchmaking industry is based on nothing more than fantasy. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes?
Does the escapement shown on the screen require lubrication at any point?
Yes, we do lubricate. The coaxials are always lubricated now. And as soon as George sort of introduces escapement into the wristwatch world, where you've got faster beats, you do require lubrication. But the great thing about the escapement is that because there is no sliding friction, it means that when the lubrication deteriorates, it doesn't affect the rate of timekeeping. And that's the real key to the escapement. You don't have the sliding friction that the lever escapement has. What else? Any more questions? Must be a few.
Is the escapement patented, or is anybody allowed to?
Anybody can use it, yeah. It originally had a 25-year patent which ran out, I think in the early 90s actually.
Is that also the case for your alteration?
Oh yes, I mean, you know, it's, yeah, for me to go down the patent world is not really an issue, yeah. Yes?
You've got Series 3?
And I'm working on it at the moment. And I've been work on the designs now for about just over 2 years. I have about, I've come to a sticking point actually, so I've just parked the watch for a few months. And there is about another 3 months work on design, and then next year I'll be building the prototype. So we're very close now. Yes, at the back.
You ended on a bit of a pessimistic tone about the straps and cases, and I don't think that's where we should is that a good start, or do you think we just need to drop that and look at movements?
Look, I mean, it has to start somewhere. I mean, I do understand that. And as I found out, I mean, watchmaking at this level is incredibly hard. And I understand that people don't have the skills, you know. I mean, that's a great problem. We are lacking these great skills in Britain. And I think ultimately what we've got to do is we've got to be honest. You know, the public aren't stupid. And we've got to be very honest with with the general public and start off on the right footing if we're ever wanting to build, you know, a watchmaking industry. And I believe that ultimately we have to be making our own mechanisms. We have to be designing our own mechanisms. Because after all, that is what the British watchmaking industry was originally built on. And unless we can get back to that sort of level, then really there is no watchmaking future. So, yeah.
And are we doing enough to nurture those skills, do you think, or do you not see it?
It's very difficult. I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, George Daniels, he wrote his book Watchmaking, and I'm hoping that there are more people out there reading. And I mean, I believe that's a real good start for any sort of industry, because you have to know watches inside out in order to really create new and original watches. I don't know. I hope that I'll be standing here in another 20, 30 years' time with a different story to tell. But that's really, we've got to be making complete watches to really start an industry. But we can never compete with the Swiss. It's impossible. I mean, the Swiss are masters at what they're doing. We'll never catch up. But what we can do is create niche watches. I mean, the British are very good at that. You know, we can create highly specialised work, whether it's Formula One or, you know, all types of engineering. We're great innovators. And as I say, I don't see the industry competing in any way with the Swiss. It's impossible. But we can focus on niche, high-quality work. That's where I believe the future is. Yes.
Because of the opportunity you've had, you've got somebody working for you who's going to continue.
Yes, there's 6 of us physically making watches in the studio. And yes, I mean, they're all capable of making watches from scratch. And they're all building their own watches in the studio. There's 1 or 2 of them who potentially could go on to designing watches, but we'll see. One of them's very young, he's about 23 or 4, but you can see there's a spark of interest in him, so we'll see what happens over the years. Yeah.
So Roger, just go back to British watchmaking. I'm certainly aware that there's an awful lot of noise amongst the British brands and the British companies about moving towards making their own movements. And there are, excuse me, quite a number of individuals, you know, striving to do just that. Do you think the British watch industry would be better served if those brands were to come together?
I mean, it's possible, it's a start, yes. But you need somebody to really sort of guide them, and ultimately you're going to have to bring Swiss expertise in. You know, they know how to mass produce watches, we don't. I mean, we make 10 watches a year. It's a start, but it's a very small start. And somebody at some point is going to have to swallow the pride and bring in the knowledge to get things going and start to educate people locally. And that'll get things going, but it'll take a huge commitment. And you need somebody with ideas, really.
And a huge amount of money.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry, just to go back to what this gentleman said.
Yes.
Do you not think that the case that the government snap or the buckle is just as important as the movement?
Well, it is. I mean, the watches that we make, we focus on everything. And the deployment is as important as one of the tiny springs or levers within the watch. It is important, yes, but my background has always been about creating a watch from start to finish, following the Daniels method. And the heart of the escapement, the heart of a watch, has always been the movement. It's what's always set aside the British from our European counterparts. You know, the British had a very, very individual style for their movements. And that was the heart, is all surrounding timekeeping, precision and quality and strength and so on. And that ultimately has got to be the heart of any watch industry. Yes?
You're going to stay the same style of watch?
Sorry?
So you're going to stay the same style of watch that you do, or change from each yourself personally?
Yes, I mean, yeah.
You're changing, do anything radical, or...
No, no, I mean, I'm not going to sort of reinvent the wheel. I mean, the watches that we make are, they're very strong, they're very English, very British, and it's a very classic style. And if you like, it's my take on, had the great British industry continued, this is where, you know, at the highest level, this is where we would be. These are the watches we would be creating. Yeah. Yes?
Would you like to make more watches every year?
I would like to, and I did have many ideas, most of them delusional, I think. But what I came to realise many years ago is it's difficult. I mean, at the level we are at. And we haven't been able to make any more than 10, 12 pieces a year since 2006. And it's not through want of trying. But it's really just the focus on the quality and attention to detail which drives me. And I'm not prepared to give that up. And if you were to suddenly hear that we were making 20 watches a year, then something would have drastically had to change in terms of design and quality of our watches. So it's not possible with what we're currently doing. Yes, at the back.
How many young watchmakers do you think need to come into the industry every year to achieve the result that you're...
Crikey, you know, it's it's very difficult, isn't it? I mean, this, as I say, I don't believe there is a real industry here at the moment, and you're talking about something, I mean, before we're making watches in England, complete watches, mass-producing watches, I think you're almost 10, 20, 30 years away. What you need to do is build a core of knowledge. And as I say, that can only come from Switzerland at the moment.
How many volumes do you think is coming to get to the 10, 100, 1,000?
Yeah, I mean, it needs to start off in the tens, certainly. You just need a few people with real interest and excitement and trying to create something. But it's got to be real quality and knowledge. That's what I was trying to say in the talk. All of George's career was based around good, solid knowledge, evidence. And that's what's gone. That's what's gone today. And to replace that is the tricky thing. I mean, that's why Formula One is so strong in England, and why really this is the heart of Formula One, because you have the real core, you have the depth of knowledge that takes generations to build. And that's why it's a very difficult task. Any more? No? Good. Thank you. Oh, is there one? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.